Why do we think Nadhim Zahawi has done this now?
Well, look, I think there are competing theories about him. If you listen to what Zahawi has said, he says that he could have had a nice life in business, having left Parliament in July 2024. He says that he was having a perfectly sort of nice enough existence, but has felt compelled to return to the political fray. Such is his despair with the direction of the country, and he gave a list of different reasons why, some of them pretty eccentric, I have to say. He compared at one point, suggested that the country, the UK at the moment, was reminding him of his childhood in Iraq. Such was the sort of sectarian politics and the state of the economy and so on. I think he has done maybe many things, but I don't think many people have often compared him to Saddam Hussein for all sorts of different reasons. But nonetheless, that was what he was saying. The Conservatives, meanwhile, suggesting that the real reason that Mr. Zahawi has made this leap is because he was sniffing around for a peerage, potentially. This is sources close to Cubby Badenoch briefing journalists this afternoon. He was sniffing around for a peerage, was denied it because of the way that, of course, people will remember, listeners will remember, that he left the cabinet. He did have lots of different jobs in the cabinet, but I had to leave the position of being Tory chairman, and I think in 2023 in the Sunak government, as a result of his tax affairs and his lack of breaking the ministerial code about all of that. But of course, you know, we should say this is the latest example, because he's not alone. This is the latest example and the most senior Conservative scalp that Reform have managed to take away. That, you know, he was, as you say, extremely briefly, blink and you'll miss it, but he was Chancellor of the Exchequer briefly, but he was many other things. Tory chairman, Education Secretary, he was vaccine minister as well. But that experience, of course, it is a double-edged sword, Aasmah, for Reform, because for two reasons. One is that there is a danger for Reform, and Labour already have been making a great deal of hay with this, that, you know, there tends to be one type of defector to the Reform Party over the last 12 months. They tend to be Conservative, and they tend not only to be Conservative, but a particular type of Conservative on the sort of real kind of Brexiter end. So I wouldn't say Zahawi is part of this necessarily, but the hard right of the Conservative Party. If you're trying to suggest that you are the change, if you are the fresh faces of politics, if you have a catalogue of ex-Conservative ministers and ex-Conservatives, of whom Nigel Farage, in the way distant past, was one, then it is perhaps difficult to sustain that idea that you are something fresh when you have such senior Conservative, previous Conservative ministers who were cabinet ministers not so long ago.
How do you think it's all going to work then? Because it doesn't, I mean, you know, Nadhim Zahawi is a reasonably big name. There are some other people who thought perhaps it might be someone else, but for now it's Nadhim Zahawi, and as you say, he's been a cabinet minister. He has a huge amount of experience. Do you think that they can all? What's actually binding them all together? Because I know you talked there about a specific type of person, but whenever I see them on the podium next to Nigel Farage, for whatever reason, because perhaps they might have criticised Nigel Farage in the past, as Nadhim Zahawi has, they just don't look that comfortable together. They're not gelling. Well,
and also there's another thing, Aasmah, which is, of course, look, the Reform, it is the British example of something we're seeing all over Europe and indeed North America as well, which is very broadly, let's call them the anti-system parties, right? We're the none of the above parties. We're the socket to the establishment parties, two fingers up to them. Now, as I say, that can be difficult, therefore, when you are absorbing a large number of people who were literally part of the system until not so long ago. There's another problem as well, and we've seen it sort of played out with some of the questions that were put to Zahawi by journalists. One of the first things he said was, and you know, this is a common diagnosis, whether you agree with it or not, Britain is broken, he says. And the first example he came up with was to say you can't get a doctor's appointment. Now, we may say there may be lots of reasons why you can't get a doctor's appointment, and everyone would agree that that is a big, big problem. And you might argue that progress isn't being made fast enough by the Labour government to arrest it. But ultimately, the big problem with public services tended to arise under the 14 years of Conservative government, which he was a member. That's number one. Number two, you get all sorts of interesting kind of different social media posts which are unearthed. You played one of the clips, but you know, you go back to 2015. What is Zahawi tweeting? I'm not British born, at Nigel Farage. I'm as British as you are, though. Your comments are offensive and racist. I would be frightened to live in a country run by you. So you can drag all of that up as well. And as well, just finally, What was Nadhim Zahawi? He was vaccines minister. That was arguably, he said at one point, a little grandly perhaps, but he claimed to be the most popular politician in the country at that time as a result of his time as vaccine minister. He was asked by a journalist for Rob Powell at Sky News, he was asked a question as to what he made, therefore, of the fact that Reform at their most recent conference in the autumn had a vaccine skeptic speaking from the conference floor. What did Zahawi do? He just dismissed it as a stupid question. So you can see with all of these things that it's a sort of uneasy alliance, politically speaking, even in terms of personality and history. And I know that some people in Reform have been worried that they are taking on too many previous Conservatives. I suspect what appealed about Zahawi was that he was such a senior Tory, and the fact he was such an ardent Brexiter with close links to Farage.
You know that tweet that you just read out? Did you say it was from 2015?
Yeah.
I mean, is it possible that, between 2015 and 2026, with everything that has gone on, and perhaps some personal assurances, who knows, but, from Nigel Farage to Nadhim Zahawi, that he'd held that position in 2015, but he's changed his mind.
Indeed so, and I think that what Zahawi's trajectory is a reflection of the movement in British politics on the right. The truth is that by comparison to 2015, when David Cameron was still Prime Minister, to where we are now at the start of 2026, there has been a massive evolution on the British right, and it has largely moved both in politics, in policy, and in general sort of temperament towards Farage and away from a more liberal conservatism that was more dominant in that time. So what you could say about Zahawi is that he is a sort of embodiment of that, someone who was favoured under the governments of David Cameron and so on. And, in the way that he was speaking today, when I talk about the temperament of politics, think about the sort of things that he was talking about. He was painting a very dark picture about the politics in Britain right now. He was talking about the rise of sectarianism. He was talking about the idea that there will be a wave of sectarian-type parliamentary candidates, problem of Islamism, the idea there is a sort of general darkness in politics overall. A lot of the talking points of the radical right, both on this side of the Atlantic and in the United States. Now, there may be individual kernels of truth in any of those particular things, but the way in which it's talked about, in a pretty exaggerated, pretty dystopian fashion, Zahawi was employing exactly those tactics. So I think you're exactly right, Aasmah, to say that I think what this is reflective of, some of it will be about his personal ambition. I'm sure he clearly wants to return to politics in some way. Some of it is seeing which way the political winds are blowing, and some of it is about the general kind of bigger political winds which have been blowing, the general trajectory of British politics on the right to a more radical right, Faragist position.